The stars above Kethara Prime were beautiful that morning. That was the cruelest part, survivors would later say. Not the fire, not the screaming of hull metal as it separated into burning ribbons, not the silence of 4,200 voices going still in the span of 11 seconds. No, the cruelest part was that the stars didn't care. They burned on, cold and perfect and utterly indifferent, while the UES Unbroken came apart like paper held to a flame. Lieutenant Commander Yemi Akafor watched it happen from the observation deck of the TSN relay station at Kethara's third moon. He'd been running a routine diagnostic. He had a coffee in his hand. He never finished it. He stood there for 6 minutes after the Unbroken disappeared from his sensors, just stood there, the mug going cold against his palm, watching the dispersing field of light that had, moments ago, been humanity's most advanced warship. Then he sat down at his console and began transmitting. Back on Earth, the signal arrived at 3:47 hours Greenwich Mean Time. It cascaded through the relay network in under 4 seconds, reaching every major government node simultaneously. In Geneva, in Nairobi, in New Shanghai, in Sao Paulo, lights came on in rooms that were supposed to be dark for another 3 hours. Generals were woken. Ministers were called. Children with a parent in the Navy were shaken awake by grandparents who didn't know how to say the words yet. In the city of Abuja, a 9-year-old girl named Zara Afar-Mensah woke to the sound of her mother crying in the next room. She pressed her ear against the wall and listened, understanding nothing except that something had changed forever. She didn't know yet that her aunt, her mother's younger sister, a weapons officer aboard the Unbroken, was among the 4,200. She wouldn't know for another hour. She would remember the sound of that crying for the rest of her life. The Unbroken had not been just a warship. In 3 centuries of humanity reaching outward into the dark, building stations and colonies, and slow diplomatic relationships with species that regarded them with everything from curiosity to contempt, the Unbroken had come to mean something. She was the flagship of the Terran Stellar Navy's First Fleet. She was the ship that had escorted the first human diplomatic delegation to the Galactic Conclave chambers. She was the ship that human children were shown pictures of in school, the one they pointed at and said, "That's ours, that's what we built." She carried not just her crew but something harder to name, a proof of concept, a statement. We are here and we are not going anywhere. The Vathari Dominion had just answered that statement. Their response came 4 hours after the attack, delivered through the standard conclave diplomatic channels with a calmness that many humans found more enraging than the attack itself. The Unbroken had violated Vathari territorial assertion boundaries. The engagement had been a lawful defensive response. The Vathari Dominion regretted any loss of life, but maintained that responsibility lay with Terran command structures that had failed to properly instruct their vessels on established spatial protocols. The Vathari ambassador, standing before the emergency session of the Galactic Conclave, did not look like a being that regretted anything. He looked like a being that was waiting for the next thing to happen. The Galactic Conclave issued its statement within 12 hours. It was long. It was carefully worded. It expressed grave concern. It called on all parties to exercise restraint. It established a subcommittee to investigate the circumstances of the incident. It used the phrase de-escalatory dialogue 11 times in 6 paragraphs. 4,200 people were not mentioned by name. In the emergency session of the Terran Security Council, Admiral Seo Yunjai sat at the end of the long table and listened to her colleagues argue. Some wanted an immediate military response. Some wanted to pursue the conclave process. Some wanted sanctions. Some wanted time. They argued for 4 hours with the particular exhausted fury of people who all knew something had to be done and none could agree on what. Admiral Seo said nothing through all of it. Then she opened her personal terminal, pulled up a file she had first read 3 years ago in a moment of idle curiosity, and placed it on the main display screen. The room went quiet. The file was a maintenance record, a status report from the Baikonur Heritage Reserve dated 18 months prior, routine inventory, structural integrity assessment, power cell degradation estimates. At the top of the file, above the columns of data, was a name. TSN Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. Hull classification, dreadnought siege pattern, status, preserved, inactive, awaiting disposition. I think, Admiral Seo said, in the silence that followed, it's time we had a different conversation. 7,000 kilometers below the room where she was speaking, in a cavern carved into the Kazakh steppe where no wind reached and no light came except the pale glow of maintenance strips, something sat in the dark and waited. It had been waiting for 90 years. It was not done. The first person to walk the Tsiolkovsky's bridge in 11 years was a maintenance technician named Bogdan Atritsenko, and he did it alone, at 200 hours, with a flashlight and a structural assessment tablet, and absolutely no idea that what he was doing would eventually be taught in military history courses across the known galaxy. He stepped through the pressure hatch, swept his light across the space, and stopped. He'd serviced orbital platforms, decommissioned cruisers, gutted freighters for salvage. He thought he understood the size of old ships. He did not. The Tsiolkovsky's bridge was vast in the way that cathedrals were vast, not just physically large, but built to make you feel the weight of purpose pressing down from above. Every surface was solid. Every console was mechanical, analog, built to be operated by human hands without digital mediation. The pilot's chair sat in the center of it all like a throne, and the main viewport, not a screen, actual glass, 18 centimeters thick, looked out at the cavern wall 200 meters away. Bogdan stood there for a long moment. "All right," he said to no one, "let's see what you've got." What she had, as the full engineering assessment over the following week would confirm, was considerably more than anyone expected. 90 years of careful preservation had kept the Tsiolkovsky's core architecture intact. The hull, 60 centimeters of layered titanium carbide played over a lattice of impact dispersion framing, had suffered surface oxidation in 3 sections and microfracturing in 1, all repairable. Her 8 primary drive nacelles were seized but not degraded. Her main armament, 12 kinetic mass driver batteries, 4 torpedo bays, and 16-point defense clusters, was cold but whole. What she didn't have was any of the systems that modern Terran warships considered essential. No adaptive hull plating that reconfigured under fire. No AI threat response suite that tracked and prioritized incoming weapons simultaneously. No quantum coherence communication system. No neural-linked targeting interface. When Admiral Seo presented the reactivation proposal to the full Security Council, these absences were the first thing the opposition raised. "She's 90 years old," said Minister Chandra Vas of the Defense Oversight Committee, and he said it like that settled the matter. "Her systems are obsolete. Her doctrine is obsolete. We'd be sending our people into a Vathari engagement in a museum piece." "Yes," said Admiral Seo. The room waited for her to say something else. She let them wait. "The Vathari's phase lance technology," she continued, pulling up a technical schematic, "works by targeting the quantum coherence layer in modern reactive armor. It essentially asks the armor what it's made of, and then tells it to stop. Every warship we've commissioned in the last 40 years uses reactive armor. The Tsiolkovsky does not. She uses layered physical plate that has no quantum coherence signature to target. A phase lance hitting her forward hull will strip titanium carbide. It will not penetrate to crew spaces unless they fire for approximately 12 minutes continuously at the same point. In that time, she will have already killed them." Another silence, a different kind. "Their kinetic countermeasures," Voss began, "are calibrated against modern kinetic profiles. The Tsiolkovsky's mass drivers fire at velocities and mass ratios that haven't been used in active combat since 2310. Their evasion algorithms have never been tested against her firing parameters, possibly never been programmed with them." Seo looked around the table. "She's not obsolete. She's foreign. There's a difference, and the Vathari are about to learn it." The vote passed 6-3. What followed was not a military operation. It was, as one exhausted engineering supervisor put it 16 days into the refit, more like archaeology performed at gunpoint. The technical specifications for the Tsiolkovsky's original systems existed in the archives, but archives described. They didn't teach you how a 90-year-old hydraulic coupling behaved differently from the diagrams when you tried to reseat it at 300 hours with 12 hours already on your body. They didn't explain the particular way her power distribution system had been hand-tuned by her original chief engineer, a woman named Svetlana Zeleniak, who had apparently considered the official specifications to be, in the words of her own maintenance logs, a polite suggestion. They needed people who knew the ship, not from documents, from memory. They found 3. Commander Yusuf Ademi Volkov had served as a junior navigation officer on the Tsiolkovsky's final deployment, 51 years ago. He was 81 years old and had been living in Lagos rebuilding antique combustion engines, a hobby he'd developed. He told the Navy liaison who came to find him, because old machines were honest. They failed in ways you could understand. He accepted the assignment before the liaison finished explaining it. Dr. Priya Sachdev had written her doctoral thesis on the Tsiolkovsky's damage control architecture. The Navy had subsequently classified 40% of her source materials, which had irritated her for 40 years. She accepted the assignment on the condition that she was given access to everything. They agreed. They were in no position to argue. Marta Zeleniak was the granddaughter of Svetlana Zeleniak, and she had grown up reading her grandmother's technical diaries, all 47 volumes. She could have told you, from memory, exactly why her grandmother had modified the power distribution nodes on decks 12 through 17. She was also, incidentally, one of the finest propulsion engineers in the Terran Stellar Navy, which was why they'd given her the Tsiolkovsky's engines to wake up. On the morning the refit began, these 3 people stood on the bridge with Admiral Seo and the newly appointed Captain Adiz Afermensa. 39 years old, decorated and quietly, precisely furious in the particular way of someone who had lost family and not yet had anything to do with that grief. Commander Ademi Volkov pressed his old hand against the helm console. "She'll need a crew," he said. "Not people who will fly her, people who will work her with their hands, the way a ship used to require." "We put out a call," Captain Afermensa said. "Voluntary, no pressure, full disclosure of assignment parameters." "How many responded?" She looked at him for a moment. 40,000 in the first week. Ademi Volkov was quiet for a long time after that. Then he nodded slowly, and something in his face that had been held very tightly seemed to release, just a little. "Good," he said, "then we have a ship." The selection process for the Tsiolkovsky's crew of 1,500 took 9 days, and it was unlike any crew selection in the history of the Terran Stellar Navy. The standard criteria, academic performance, simulation scores, psychological profiling, technical certifications, were still part of it. But the selection board added something that had never been formally codified before, something that the senior examiners struggled to name in their official notes and eventually wrote down as manual competency and comfort with analog systems. What it actually meant in practice was this: could you do the job with your hands when the computer that usually did it was gone? The Tsiolkovsky had no AI targeting suite. Her weapons operators would aim manually, using optical and radar-assisted sights calibrated to their individual vision. Her navigators would plot course corrections by hand, cross-referencing stellar positioning with physical charts and the kind of mental arithmetic that had once been standard and was now considered quaint. Her damage control teams would physically run, to wherever the ship was being hurt, carrying welding equipment and sealant, and the accumulated practical knowledge of what to do when something that shouldn't be open is open, and the vacuum of space is trying to come through it. The candidates who made it through selection shared one quality more than any other. They were not intimidated by the ship's age. They were drawn to it. Senior weapons officer Kenji Nakamura had grown up on his family's fishing boat in the outer Hokkaido archipelago, running systems that his father maintained by hand, because replacement parts for automated marine systems cost more than they were worth. He knew what it was to operate in an environment that gave you exactly what you put in, and nothing more. He scored higher on the manual targeting simulations than anyone else in the candidate pool. When the selection board asked him why he wanted to serve on the Tsiolkovsky, he was quiet for a moment, then said, "Because she doesn't pretend to be easier than she is." Chief Medical Officer Dr. Amara Ose had served on 3 modern warships and had watched soldiers die in ways that sophisticated medical systems couldn't prevent because the damage happened faster than the systems could respond. She had been reading about the Tsiolkovsky's original medical bay design, a system built around the assumption that in a battle, the doctor needed to act without waiting for a diagnostic AI. She signed her application the morning the call went out. She didn't need 9 days to think about it. Engineering Crew Chief Thomas Roble had never served on a capital ship. He'd spent 15 years maintaining deep space mining platforms, machines that were old, complex, and couldn't afford to stop working because there was no one coming to help. The Tsiolkovsky's engine room, when he first walked through it, looked to him less like a military installation and more like a very large, very serious version of every platform he'd ever kept running through sheer stubbornness and intimate knowledge of how metal behaved under stress. "I know this kind of machine," he told Marta Zeleniak, who was showing him around the engine spaces. She handed him his grandmother's diaries. The relevant volume was already open to the right page. "You're going to need these," she said. Training began before the refit was complete, which meant the crew was learning the ship while the engineers were still rebuilding her. This created an environment that was chaotic in ways the Navy's training doctrine had not anticipated. Damage control teams drilled in corridors where welders were actively working 10 meters away. Weapons operators ran targeting exercises, while the optical sighting systems were still being calibrated around them. Navigation teams plotted courses on charts spread across floors, because the chart tables weren't installed yet. None of them complained. Captain Offermensa walked the ship every day. Not inspections, walks. She would move through each section, watch her people working and training, ask questions, answer them, stand in the rooms that were still being rebuilt and imagine them full of fire and pressure loss and the kind of noise that battles produced. She was building a map in her mind. Not of the ship's physical layout, she had that memorized before she'd set foot aboard, but of how her crew moved through it, how they thought, what they did when the expected thing didn't happen. She had a particular ritual. Every night before she slept, she went to the bridge and sat in the command chair with the lights off and the viewport looking out at the cavern darkness. She sat there and she thought about her aunt. She thought about the Unbroken. She thought about 4,200 people who had followed orders and done their jobs and trusted that their ship could protect them. She didn't allow herself to cry, not because she thought crying was weak, she was long past that kind of thinking, but because she decided, with cold deliberateness, that she would save the grief for after. There was something to do first, and it would require everything she had. On day 43 of the refit, Marta Zeleniak walked onto the bridge with oil on her hands and a look on her face that was halfway between exhausted and stunned. "I woke up the primary drive sequence," she said. Captain Offermensa looked at her. "The engines," Zeleniak continued. "There they work, all 8. My grandmother's modifications are still holding. I didn't expect," she stopped, pressed her lips together. "She's alive, Captain. The old girl's actually alive." The Tsiolkovsky left Earth's orbit 89 days after the Unbroken died. She left without ceremony. No broadcast. No crowds. The Galactic Conclave, still in deliberations, issued a formal notice of objection which the Terran government acknowledged and ignored. 3 junior member states of the Conclave transmitted private messages of encouragement that they would publicly deny sending. In the Vathari Dominion, an intelligence officer noted the launch, identified the vessel class, and filed a brief report. He classified it as low threat. He would not be in that post much longer, Nobody slept well the first week out. It wasn't fear, exactly, or not only fear. It was the ship itself. The Tsiolkovsky moved differently from every modern vessel her crew had served on. Modern warships were smooth. They dampened vibration, filtered engine sound, regulated temperature and pressure with such precision that you could sometimes forget you were in a machine at all. The Tsiolkovsky never let you forget. She vibrated. Not catastrophically. This wasn't a malfunction. It was the natural resonance of 8 massive drive nacelles pushing 68,000 tons of metal through space at a velocity that the hull's mass dampeners handled with brute physical counterforce instead of active compensation systems. You felt it in your feet. You felt it in your back teeth when the main drives ran at full power. On Deck 7, there was a particular corridor where the resonance frequency made the lighting strips hum at a pitch just below human discomfort, and the crew who berthed in that section took to sleeping with soft wax in their ears. They kept the corridor. No one requested reassignment. There was something about the hum that people, after a few days, began to find reassuring. The Tsiolkovsky was talking. She was telling you she was working. Captain Offermensa ran drills 6 hours a day, every day without exception. The drill sequence she had designed with Commander Adamy Volkov and Dr. Sachdev was nothing like standard TSN training. Standard TSN training was built around speed, getting your crew to the point where they could operate their stations so instinctively that response time shrank to near zero. That was the right approach for AI-assisted systems. The Tsiolkovsky required something different. She required not just speed but understanding. If your targeting computer goes down on a modern warship, you call for emergency protocols and wait for backup systems. On the Tsiolkovsky, if your targeting assistance failed, you aimed yourself. And you couldn't aim yourself if you didn't understand in your body and not just your mind the relationship between the weapon, the target's movement, and the physics connecting them. Kenji Nakamura ran his weapons teams until their hands knew the manual controls the way a musician's hands know an instrument. He was not a cruel instructor. He was a precise one. When someone made an error, he didn't raise his voice. He said, "Again," and they did it again, and again, until the motion was automatic and the calculation was instinct. In an engagement, he told them on the 3rd day of weapons drilling, you will not have time to think. The part of your brain that does deliberate, careful thinking is too slow. What we are building, what we are putting into your hands right now in this room with these controls is a faster part, an older part, the part that catches something when it falls without deciding to. One of his junior operators, a young woman named Sophia Reyes, who had scored near the top of her class in AI-assisted gunnery, asked him, "What if we still miss?" Nakamura looked at her. "Then you adjust and fire again," he said. "That is the entire answer. There is no other answer. The ship doesn't die because you miss once. The ship dies if you stop." On day 12, they conducted a full combat simulation. The first time the entire crew operated together under simulated battle conditions. Captain Offermensa ran the scenario herself, calling out attack vectors and damage reports from her command chair, while the bridge crew worked around her, and the rest of the ship responded through the internal comm net. They performed badly. Not catastrophically, no one panicked, no critical stations went unmanned, but the response times were slow. The coordination between sections was ragged, and in the damage control simulation, a notional hull breach on Deck 4 went unsealed for 47 seconds. In a real engagement against a real phase lance, that was a dead section. "Good," Captain Offermensa said, when the simulation ended. The bridge was silent. People expected consequences. "Now you know exactly what we need to fix," she said. "We fix it. We run it again." They ran it again. On day 19, the same simulation took the Tsiolkovsky's crew 11 seconds to seal a Deck 4 breach. On day 26, they had it down to 6. By day 30, it was 4, under the threshold that Dr. Sachdev's architectural analysis had identified as survivable even against sustained fire. By day 40, The crew had stopped thinking of the Tsiolkovsky as an old ship they had been assigned to. They had started thinking of her as theirs. There was a moment, small, unremarkable in isolation, that Captain Offermensa would remember later as the one when she knew they were ready. It was late, past 2300 hours ship's time. She was making her rounds and she passed through the engine room, where Thomas Robel's team should have been on minimum staffing. Instead, she found 8 of them gathered around a secondary coolant relay that had been showing minor fluctuation readings. They weren't on shift. They weren't assigned to the repair. They had noticed the readings, come down on their own time, and were fixing it together, Robel with Zeleniak's diary open on his tablet, 2 others following his instructions, 3 more standing by with components, 1 keeping a running log of what they were doing and why. They looked up when she came in. Robel started to explain. "I can see what you're doing," she said. "Carry on." She walked the rest of her rounds with something quiet settling in her chest. It wasn't confidence exactly. It was solider than confidence. It was the feeling of a crew that had stopped needing to be told to care and had simply started. On day 47, they crossed the outer boundary of Vathari contested space. Offermensa ordered all active sensors shut down. The Tsiolkovsky went dark, no transponder, no active emissions, navigating on stellar positioning calculated by hand the way sailors had once navigated by stars. In the dark between systems, she moved slowly, cold and enormous, and the Vathari patrol net's automated sensors swept past her 3 times and found nothing worth reporting. She was not built to be invisible. She was built to be something their sensors had never needed to look for. The 3 Vathari interdictors came out of their patrol route at 6:14 ship's time, responding to what their passive arrays had flagged as a large cold mass on an anomalous trajectory. Their classification systems cycled through known vessel profiles, found nothing definitive, and kicked the contact to manual assessment. The assessment officer on the lead interdictor was a being named Veth Saral, who had 17 years of border patrol experience and had never once encountered a situation his training hadn't prepared him for. He looked at the contact profile on his display, noted the mass, the velocity, the thermal signature, or rather, the near absence of thermal signature, and made the assessment that seemed most logical. Debris he noted in the patrol log. Large, possible navigational hazard, investigating. He did not note it as a warship because his threat classification system had never encountered a warship that looked like this. On the Tsiolkovsky's bridge, Captain Offermensa watched the 3 contacts resolve on her passive sensors with the quality of stillness that her crew had come to recognize as the particular stillness of someone who was moving very fast inside while standing very still outside. "Weapons," she said quietly. "Status." "All batteries nominal," Nakamura replied, equally quiet. "Manual targeting is live. I have firing solutions on all 3. Hold until my order. Navigation, give me an intercept angle that keeps us between them and the relay station. Damage control, stand by." She paused. "And someone tell Deck 7 to stop that card game and get to stations." Deck 7's card game had been going on for 11 days. She had never officially acknowledged knowing about it. The effect of her knowing about it while saying nothing had been considerable for crew morale. She heard the scramble of boots through the deck plating. The Vathari interdictors were 140 kilometers out when their active sensors swept the Tsiolkovsky properly for the first time. There was a brief pause. She could imagine the confusion on those bridges, the classification systems throwing errors. And then all 3 went to active tracking, and the patrol leader transmitted an identification demand on standard conclave frequencies. "Should we respond?" her communications officer asked. "No," Offermensa said. The Vathari fired. The phase lance hit the Tsiolkovsky's port forward quarter, and the entire ship rang like a struck bell. The sound was enormous, not an explosion but a vast, resonant clang that traveled through the hull and up through the floor plates and through the soles of every boot and into every body aboard. Several people stumbled. Emergency lighting snapped on in 3 sections. Somewhere deep in the ship, something secondary cracked and began venting atmosphere that the damage control system immediately began addressing. The armor held. Of course it held. Damage, Offermensa said when the ringing faded. Port forward quarter, sections 7 through 12, came the report. Hull ablation, 12 centimeters estimated. No penetration. All crew spaces intact. 12 centimeters, she had 60, she breathed. Weapons, she said, fire. Nakamura had his solutions. He'd had them for 4 minutes. His teams were already preloaded, pre-aimed, pre-calculated. The Tsiolkovsky's mass drivers had not fired in combat in over 50 years, and when they did, the sound was different from the phase Lance hit. Not a bell but a hammer, a series of tremendous mechanical concussions that shook the ship from the inside. The felt physical reality of enormous masses of metal accelerating to significant fractions of the speed of light and departing through the guns into the dark. The Vathari interdictor's evasion systems were calibrated against modern kinetic profiles. They began their standard evasion patterns. Those patterns were built on the behavioral models of current-generation kinetic weapons, specific velocities, specific dispersal, specific timing. The Tsiolkovsky's mass drivers did not match any of those models. The first interdictor simply ceased to exist. There was no debris field to speak of. The mass driver rounds converted it too thoroughly. The second took a partial hit that was still enough to breach its drive section and send it spinning into the kind of uncontrolled rotation that its damaged systems were not built to correct. The third, to its pilot's considerable credit, broke from the engagement pattern and ran, transmitting emergency signals on every available frequency. It didn't make it far enough. On the Tsiolkovsky's bridge, the silence after the engagement had the quality of held breath slowly released. Confirmed kills, too, Nakamura reported. Third contact destroyed, no survivors detected. He was quiet for a moment. Engagement time, 11 seconds. Captain Offermensa let the silence sit for exactly 3 heartbeats, long enough for the reality of what had just happened to settle, short enough not to let it become weight. Damage control report, she said. 5 secondary junction is venting, sealed as of 40 seconds ago. No casualties. Port hull ablation confirmed at 9 centimeters average. Their phase lances are strong, but we're not giving them enough time to focus fire. Chief Damage Control Officer Reyes, yes, Sophia Reyes, who had been asking questions in weapons training a month ago and was now the best damage control officer on the ship, delivered this with the tone of someone reading a status report that was going satisfactorily. Good, Offermensa looked at her display. The Vathari signals would have been received by their nearest regional command post. She estimated 30 minutes before the situation changed substantially. Navigation, ahead 3/4, were not done. In the Vathari Dominion's regional command post for the Kethara sector, the distress signals from the patrol were received, assessed, and retransmitted to Fleet Command with a priority classification that had not been used in 40 years. The words accompanying the signals were brief. Unknown vessel, old profile, lost all 3 interdictors in under 2 minutes. Request immediate clarification and reinforcement. The fleet commander who read that request pulled up the identification files that his intelligence staff had prepared months ago, when Earth had made its launch announcement. He read the classification of the Tsiolkovsky, obsolete, low threat, museum piece, and he looked at the patrol report again. He sent for his senior tactical officer. "Tell me everything you know," he said carefully, "about old human worship doctrine." His senior tactical officer, it turned out, knew very little. That was the first problem. The Vathari adapted. They were always going to. They were an old civilization, older than humanity by several thousand years, and whatever else could be said about them, they had not survived that long by repeating mistakes. Within 72 hours of the patrol engagement, the Kethara regional fleet had been recalled from its dispersed patrol pattern and consolidated into a single interdiction force of 16 vessels, positioned between the Tsiolkovsky's tracked approach vector and the inner system. They had also changed tactics. The Phase Lance batteries had been repositioned to secondary priority. Their new primary weapon was volume, a coordinated kinetic barrage from multiple ships simultaneously, designed to saturate the target's point defense envelope and overwhelm the hull through sheer accumulated impact. It was a reasonable decision. Against any other ship in the Terran fleet, it would have worked. The Tsiolkovsky's point defense network was 16 clusters of rotating multi-barrel guns, fast, mechanical, requiring human operators to supervise targeting priorities in real time. Against the first wave of kinetic fire, they knocked down approximately 70% of incoming rounds. The remaining 30% hit the hull. What followed, from the Vathari fleet commander's perspective, was deeply disorienting. Modern warships absorb damage until they reach a threshold, and then they fail, systems cascade, power reroutes exhaust themselves, structural integrity collapses in a progression that, once started, could rarely be stopped. The failure mode was well understood and tactically legible. You could watch an enemy ship die and know at what point it stopped being a threat. The Tsiolkovsky did not behave this way. She took hits. She kept firing. She took more hits. She kept firing. She lost a secondary comm array, kept firing. She lost 3-point defense clusters on her starboard side, compensated by shifting fire angles on the remaining ones, and kept firing. A sustained Phase Lance barrage finally broke through on her port midship section and tore a 20-meter gash in her outer hull. And the damage control teams were in that section before the breach had fully propagated, sealing it with physical barricades and emergency welding while the ship fought around them. 22 people died in the first 2 hours of the engagement. Captain Afirmensa was told their names as they fell. She repeated each one quietly to herself and filed them in a part of her mind that she had walled off for now. The wall would come down later. She promised each name that it would. Nakamura, she said between names. Starboard battery, shift targeting priority to their drive sections. Don't let them reposition. A pause. Captain, we've been at this 3 hours, my teams. Are they stopping? Another pause, shorter. No, Captain. Then neither are we. The thing that the Vathari fleet commander had not adequately modeled was not the Tsiolkovsky's armor or her weapons or even her damage control capability. It was the crew. Modern warships reduced the human element in combat as much as possible, not out of disrespect for human capability, but because humans were fragile and fallible, and AI systems were faster. The Tsiolkovsky's design philosophy had run in the opposite direction. She was built on the assumption that when everything else failed, when the systems were down and the power was rerouted, and the damage was in places the damage control manual hadn't anticipated, what you had left was people who knew what they were doing and refused to stop. The battle lasted 9 hours. 9 hours was not a modern engagement. Modern fleet engagements lasted minutes, sometimes seconds. 9 hours was a grinding, brutal, exhausting contest of attrition in which the Tsiolkovsky's crew operated their manual systems, ran their damage control, and maintained their fighting capability through a sustained act of collective will that had no real parallel in current naval doctrine. When it ended, when the last Vathari vessel in the interdiction fleet had been destroyed or withdrawn, the Tsiolkovsky was burning on 3 decks, missing 1 nacelle entirely, and had lost her secondary fire control system, 2 torpedo bays, and the entirety of Deck 5's crew spaces. She had also destroyed 11 of 16 Vathari vessels, and driven the remaining 5 into a retreat that their commanders were already reporting to fleet headquarters as a rout. Thomas Roble in the engine room had kept 6 nacelles running through the entire 9 hours through a combination of Zeleniak's diary, personal improvisation, and what he later described to a journalist, with characteristic understatement, as a lot of very fast guessing. Dr. Osai in the medical bay had operated for 7 of those 9 hours. When it was over, she sat on the floor of the surgical suite and let herself shake for exactly 3 minutes, then stood up and kept working. Sophia Reyes, who had asked what to do if you miss, had sealed 14 separate hull breaches during the engagement. She had not missed once. In the Galactic Conclave, the ongoing deliberations on the unbroken incident had been running for nearly 2 months. The reports coming in from the Cathara sector arrived in the middle of a session. An aide brought a summary to the Secretary General. The Secretary General read it, then read it again. The deliberations went quiet. His name was High Admiral Teth Varak, and he had commanded the Vathari Dominion's military forces for 23 years. He had negotiated the Cathara territorial expansion. He had authorized the action against the Unbroken. He had classified the Tsiolkovsky as a low threat in the intelligence brief that now sat on his desk like an accusation. He was not a being who panicked. But he was, by his own private admission, beginning to understand that he had made an error in the particular category of errors that his people called sight blindness. The failure to see a thing clearly because you had already decided what it was. He had seen an old ship. He had decided low threat. He had therefore failed to see what the old ship meant. Teth Varak pulled up every piece of intelligence on humanity that his office maintained. He read it not with the eyes of a tactician looking for military vulnerabilities, but with something older, with the eyes of a being trying to understand what kind of people he was dealing with. What he found was not reassuring. Humans were young, as spacefaring civilizations went. Their deep space history was barely 3 centuries old, and yet in those 3 centuries they had fought 3 interstellar conflicts, survived 2 events that should by any statistical modeling have ended them, and built themselves back up from each one not to where they'd been before but to somewhere further. There was a pattern in the data. Not just resilience, species resilience was common enough. It was something more directed than that. Every civilization that had fought humanity, he read, had made the same mistake. They had calculated a breaking point, a level of damage at which a rational adversary would conclude that further resistance was not worthwhile. And humans had consistently performed the deeply irrational act of not breaking at it. Worse, they got angry. Not the hot, uncontrolled anger that led to mistakes. The cold, purposeful anger that led to ships like the Tsiolkovsky, the decision not to fight smart but to fight permanent. He asked his intelligence staff the question that should have been asked months ago. What else do they have? The report arrived in 12 hours. His chief intelligence officer delivered it personally, which was, in Varak's experience, never a good sign. Humanity maintained 6 additional Tsiolkovsky-class hulls in various states of preservation. The Tsiolkovsky herself had been the most degraded. The other 6 were in better condition. The Terran government had, according to signals intelligence intercepted over the past 6 weeks, begun preliminary assessments on all 6 hulls. And this was before accounting for their active fleet, which was also, according to current assessments, in the process of implementing anti-phase lance modifications based on observed battlefield data from the Tsiolkovsky's engagement. Teth Varak sat with this information for a very long time. Then he opened a diplomatic communication channel. The response from the Tsiolkovsky's command arrived 11 minutes later, not from an aide, not from a diplomatic officer, from Captain Offermensa directly on a burned-out bridge, with the emergency lighting giving her face a quality that Varak's cultural advisors later described as not particularly welcoming. She sent terms. They were not gentle terms. They addressed the Unbroken directly: reparations, formal acknowledgement of the act as unlawful aggression, a territorial settlement that gave humanity everything they had been refused for 40 years of negotiating. They addressed the crew of the Unbroken by name, not the 4,200 as a statistic, but by individual names, listed in full, 4,200 names, Attached to the message as a separate document that Teth Varak's communication system took 3 minutes to fully receive. He read 23 of them before he had to stop. His diplomatic advisor suggested that the terms were unreasonable and that there was room for counter-negotiation. Teth Varak looked at the tactical map of the Cathara approach. He looked at what had happened to 16 of his ships. He looked at the intelligence report about the 6 hulls in storage. "Make no counteroffer," he said. "Request clarification on implementation timelines. Stall. I need to understand her position before Cathara Prime." The advisor transmitted the request. Offermensa's response came back in 4 minutes. "Clarification. The terms are final. The timeline is whenever we finish repairs. If you want to renegotiate, begin before we arrive." Teth Varak drafted a note to the full Dominion High Council that same evening. He recommended acceptance of the terms. He included in the recommendation a strategic assessment that he had written himself, with no aide's help, that ended with a single observation. "We destroyed their flagship. They sent us the ship they built before they knew how to be cautious. If we decline these terms, I believe they will send the others. I do not believe we can afford to find out what they built after." The High Council received the note. They deliberated for 3 days. They did not accept the terms. They weren't done being proud yet. That would cost them Cathara Prime. The Tsiolkovsky arrived at Cathara Prime on a Tuesday. Aboard the ship, no one mentioned that. There was no ceremony. Captain Offermensa stood on the bridge in a uniform that had a burn mark on the left sleeve that the quartermaster had offered to replace and she had declined. And she looked at the planet on the main viewport, the actual glass viewport, 18 centimeters thick, not a screen. And she thought about the last time a Terran warship had looked at this world and what had happened to it. She thought about her aunt, just for a moment, just to remember why she was here. Then she broadcast on all frequencies. She used every language that Tsiolkovsky's communication suite carried. She used the old conclave standard. She used the 3 major Vathari dialects. She used, because it seemed appropriate, the plain, unadorned Terran that humans spoke when they were done with diplomatic indirection. "This is Captain Adiz Offermensa of the TSN Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. I am here for Cathara Prime. Your choices are straightforward. Yield your position and this ends. Don't yield and it also ends. The difference is what it costs you." She gave them 4 minutes. The Vathari fleet that Teth Varak had assembled in Cathara's high orbit was considerable, 22 vessels, their heaviest available in this theater, arranged in a layered defensive formation that their tactical systems had spent 2 weeks calculating as optimal. Their commanders had studied the engagement data from the interdiction battle exhaustively. They had recalibrated their phase lance frequencies, adjusted their kinetic dispersal patterns, identified what they believed were the Tsiolkovsky's structural weak points based on observed damage accumulation. They had done everything right. The 4 minutes expired. They fired first, they always had, and it had always worked. What followed was not the engagement their tactical models had predicted. It was longer, it was louder. It was the kind of battle that didn't resolve in clean tactical phases, but instead became a grinding, total, remorseless contest in which the Tsiolkovsky moved through the Vathari formation, not like a blade, but like something geological, something that did not speed up or slow down based on what was done to it but simply continued. Sustained by the aggregate will of 1,500 people who had drilled for this, until it was encoded in their muscles and their instincts, and whatever part of a human being sits deeper than training. Nakamura's teams fired without stopping. When one operator's hand started to shake, not from fear but from hours of sustained manual operation, the body's protest against its own sustained demand, the operator next to them reached across and steadied the aim without being asked, without breaking their own rhythm. Rays sealed breaches. Os treated wounds. Roble kept 6 nacelles running with 3 going intermittently and 1 completely dark. routing power through pathways that Svetlana Zeleniak's diaries described as emergency only, and that Marta Zeleniak had quietly reinforced during the refit because she'd suspected her grandmother was being conservative. Captain Offermensa stood. She did not sit in the command chair during the engagement. She stood, moved between stations, called decisions, read the battle as it evolved and adjusted continuously. She was the ship's nervous system in those hours, the part that integrated everything and responded, the part that had been trained by every drill and every late night and every walk through every section of the ship to know what was needed before it was asked for. She took a piece of shrapnel in the left arm from a bridge console that took a secondary hit. She had it field-dressed in 90 seconds and returned to the center of the bridge. When the last Vathari vessel either died or fled, the Tsiolkovsky held Cathara Prime's orbit alone. The silence on the bridge had a different quality from the silence after the patrol engagement or after the interdiction battle. It was heavier. It was earned differently. It was the silence of people who had gone to the absolute bottom of themselves and found, to something that wasn't quite surprise, that the bottom held. Offermensa looked at Cathara Prime on the viewport. The planet was unchanged, still there, still turning, indifferent in the way all planets were indifferent. But it was free, which it had not been 8 hours ago. Nakamura, she said, casualties. He told her. She repeated every name quietly to herself. Then she opened a channel to Cathara Prime's colonial administration, the Terran colonists who had been under Vathari jurisdiction for 3 years, who had watched the battle from the surface and were not entirely sure yet that it was over. "This is Captain Offermensa," she said. "You're free. We're staying until relief arrives. You're safe." She closed the channel. Ademi Volkov, who had been standing at the rear of the bridge for the entire engagement, watching with the particular expression of a man watching something he had always believed was possible but had never expected to actually see, came forward slowly and stood beside her. They looked at the planet together. "She did well," he said finally. He meant the ship. "She did," Offermensa said. In the Galactic Conclave, the formal acceptance of Terran peace terms by the Vathari Dominion's High Council arrived 6 hours after the Cathara Prime engagement. The acceptance included a strategic assessment document that Teth Varak had submitted, with the recommendation that it be distributed to all Conclave member states. The document noted that humanity currently maintained 6 Tsiolkovsky-class hulls in preservation. It noted the active fleet modifications underway. It noted the 40,000 volunteers who had signed up to serve on the Tsiolkovsky, and observed that there was, in the relevant Terran cultural data, no indication that this response had been considered unusual by the human public. It noted the names of 4,200 dead, and observed that humanity had chosen to answer their deaths, not with the most advanced thing it had, but with the thing it had built when it was still young, and did not yet know what to be afraid of. The document ended with a single sentence that various conclave scholars would spend the next decade arguing about. "We recommend that all parties consider carefully what it means that this was not their last resort." The Tsiolkovsky returned to Earth 4 months later. She came home the same way she'd left, quietly, without broadcast, the way old ships move when they don't need to announce themselves. She settled back into her berth in the Baikonur Cavern, and her crew filed off over 2 days, returning to families and cities and the ordinary world that had waited for them. Ademi Volkov walked off the ship last, behind the captain, the way a junior officer properly should. He pressed his hand one more time to the hull before he went through the exterior lock. He stood there for a moment with his palm flat against the metal that had been through fire and vacuum and 9 months of the hardest possible use. The metal was warm. Captain Offermensa went home to her mother's house in Abuja. Her niece Zara, not yet 11, old enough now to understand more than she'd understood on the morning she heard her mother crying through a wall, met her at the door. Zara had questions. She always had questions. She wanted to know everything about the ship, the battle, what it was like. Captain Offerminsa answered some of them and said she'd answer the rest another time, and they went inside and had dinner, and outside the city went on being alive. That night, after Zara was asleep, Adiz Offerminsa sat on the porch of her childhood home and finally let the wall down. She cried for a long time. For the people she'd lost, for her aunt on the Unbroken, for the weight that had been on her chest for 9 months that she had promised to set down after, and this was after. Then she went asleep. In the Baikonur Heritage Reserve, in the deep cavern where no wind reached, the Tsiolkovsky sat in the dark. She had burns on her hull in 37 places. She was missing a nacelle. Her port forward armor had been replaced in sections, the new metal a slightly different shade from the old. She looked like what she was, a ship that had been used, a ship that had been needed, a ship that had done what she was built to do and come home. Her power cells were active, just enough to run the maintenance systems, just enough to keep her ready, just in case someone had to come looking for her again. She could wait. She was good at waiting. She always had been. And